So it's fine. Now we are live with Professor Noam Chomsky. Okay, I just want to check with the audience if they can hear us and see us well. Yes, before we start, we are live with Professor Noam Chomsky. So I would like to ask you one question to check if you can see and hear us well. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
I need your, yes. Thank you, Professor. Yes, for the audience, I need your feedback, please. Do you hear me well? It's for the audience. Yeah, we can. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's get started. So now we are live with Professor Noam Chomsky. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or maybe good morning for those who are watching us from the US or other parts of the world. It is my privilege now to extend to you a warm welcome on behalf of Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah University in Fes. I'm really honored to welcome and introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Noam Chomsky, who is going to talk about world politics and COVID-19 and so much more. Before we start, I would like to seize this opportunity to thank the president of Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah University in Fes, Dr. Ridwan Marabat, for his tireless leadership of the university, for his support to host such enlightening events. Thanks to him, our university has become a precious thing, a great gift to our community, a great opportunity for students, and a source of new knowledge, discovery, creativity, and artistic expression for Moroccans. Actually, it has become a place of hope, optimism, and transformation. Let me also express my gratitude and thanks to the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Humanities, SAIS FES, Dr. Bouzouita Samir, for putting a tremendous amount of effort into improving student success and the productivity of research laboratories. Today, our guest is very special, a hero of many generations. And actually, he doesn't need any introduction because he is very known internationally. But for the sake of the new generation and young people who do not know him, I would be happy to give a brief introduction to him. Professor Noam Chomsky, the world-renowned political dissident, linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, and social critic. He is considered the father of modern linguistics. Professor Noam Chomsky is also a major figure in analytic philosophy and one of the founders of the field of cognitive science. He holds a joint appointment at as Institute Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where he taught for more than 50 years, and now laureate professor at the University of Arizona. And he is the author of more than 100 books on topics such as linguistics, war, politics, and mass media. Ideologically, he aligns with anarcho-syndicalism and libertarian socialism. Chomsky has long been the most cited living author on the all-time list. He is 8th after Marx, Lenin, Shakespeare, Aristotle, Plato, and Freud. Chomsky has influenced a broad array of academic fields. He is widely recognized as having helped to spark the cognitive revolution in the human sciences, contributing to the development of a new cognitivistic framework for the study of language and the mind. Professor Chomsky is an electrifying speaker sharp as a razor in debate, but warm and amiable in conversation. He is both the most moral and the most knowledgeable person I have ever seen. I hope he lives to be more than 100. Actually, the world will be an emptier, lonelier, and less just place without him. I know, Professor Noam Chomsky, that you are swamped with interview requests all the time. So on behalf of Sidi Muhammad bin Abdullah University, I would like to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. This is maybe the first time for a Moroccan university to host such a historic event officially with Professor Noam Chomsky. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. It is a great honor to be here with us for all of us. And as you know, people are joining us today from different parts of the world, not only from Morocco. Thank you very much again, Professor Chomsky.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So as a reminder, just for the audience, you can ask questions directly during the interview, and I'm sure Professor Noam Chomsky will be pleased to answer all of your questions at the end, of course, of this interview, if the questions have not been covered. Professor Noam Chomsky, as you know, humanity has many challenges, including global warming, the threats of a nuclear catastrophe, the immigration crisis, among others. But today, we are facing an unprecedented phenomenon for the majority of the planet's inhabitants, that is of COVID-19 pandemic. And as you know, President like the President Bush and Barack Obama already talked about this pandemic, the arrival of this pandemic. Even nowadays, Bill Gates has been talking about this pandemic. Do you think, Professor, this crisis could have been avoided, and what are its origins? The floor is yours, Professor.
It's a very important question, not academic. The answer to that question will determine how we can deal with the next pandemic that's coming, which is very likely to be worse than this one. If you go back to 2003, after the SARS epidemic was contained, scientists were telling us loud and clear that another one is coming, and here's what we have to do to prepare for it. Not much was done. The drug companies, huge resources, wonderful labs, but they're not interested because they follow capitalist logic. You do what you can make profit on tomorrow. That's something that you can sell a lot tomorrow, not something that you may be able to use 10 years from now when there's a catastrophe. So they didn't do anything. What about government? Government has, again, wonderful laboratories, huge resources, but they're blocked. They're blocked by the neoliberal plague, which says that, as Ronald Reagan put it when he came into office, government is the problem, not the solution. We have to turn everything over to the private sector, with consequences we've seen around the world in the last 40 years. But one consequence is government couldn't act. Well, in fact, governments did act to some extent. So George W. Bush, as you mentioned, did take initial efforts to prepare for some likely pandemic, anticipated pandemic. But when President Obama took office, January 2009, his first act within the first few days was to call the Presidential Scientific Advisory Council, request a pandemic response system to be described. And a few weeks later, they came back with a detailed program. He implemented it. There were also programs of American scientists going to China, working with colleagues to study coronaviruses. They anticipated another coronavirus would come like SARS and be the next major pandemic. This continued until January 2017. President Trump came into office. First days in office, disbanded the whole thing. No pandemic response system. Then he began to defund the Center for Disease Control and other health-related parts of the government. He has been doing that every year. He continued to do it in February 2020, while the pandemic was raging. He was denying it. Without going through the rest of the details, which are pretty sordid, the end result is that the United States is now an outlier of the world. In late March, the United States and the European Union were approximately equal in number of cases, number of deaths. Since then, curve has very sharply declined for Europe. They're opening up the societies, not totally under control, but progressing. The United States has gotten worse. Maybe 160, 170,000 people killed, and the situation's getting worse. Where I live in Arizona, it's one of the worst hotspots in the world. All of this is avoidable. We've seen, in fact, when China produced the genome sequence and provided the genome to the world on January 10th, very quickly, countries where the governments cared about their citizens acted, and very effectively. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, a little bit later, some of the European countries, and have the situation pretty much under control. So it's a terrible situation, but it's avoidable. We're now facing the same thing. Though we will somehow emerge from this pandemic at terrible and unnecessary cost. But there'll be another one. And if you think about it, so far we've been lucky. There have been coronaviruses which are highly contagious, but not too lethal, like this one. There have been others that are not very contagious, but highly lethal, like Ebola. Next time around, we might not be lucky. Could be one that's highly contagious and very lethal. We know how to prepare for it. We know what the barriers are. Basically three. One, capitalist logic, which bars the pharmaceutical corporations. Two, the plague of neoliberalism, which transfers everything away from government. Three, incompetent and malevolent leadership. Put those three together, spells catastrophe.
Yes, Professor Chomsky, as you know, that's COVID-19. Many people are dying because of COVID-19. What mistake do you believe have been made in the US, Italy, and Europe when dealing with the pandemic?
Well, actually, Italy is where the pandemic struck hardest in Europe. Northern Italy was very badly hit, partly because it has an elderly population, which is more susceptible for other reasons. But Italy is opening up. They have it pretty much under control. Not perfect by any means, but not as good as East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, New Zealand, but pretty effectively. The biggest mistake was lack of preparation. Then comes the question of doing what has to be done. Europe, aside from the UK, Europe followed the advice of American and other scientists, and it's worked reasonably well. could be better, but reasonably well. The US ignored that advice. We have in the White House an administration which despises science. It's not just on this issue. Science is bad. We don't want science. The guru of the White House, Rush Limbaugh, reaches tens of millions of people on his program. The president just gave him the Medal of Freedom in respect for his work. He tells his tens of millions of audience of people that there are four corners of deceit in the country. Government, media, academia, and science. They thrive on deceit, so don't pay any attention to them. Well, tens of millions of people listen to that. They hear the same thing on Fox News, the Murdoch channel. They hear it from the White House. It's all they hear, tend to believe it. I won't run through the polls, but what Republicans believe is just astonishing. So, yes, you have to have an educated population, you have to understand, and you have to have a leadership that's responsible to the population, not just to the rich and powerful who it serves. Actually, we're talking about COVID-19, which is bad enough. We will emerge from COVID-19. Even the United States will emerge. We're not going to emerge from the melting of the polar ice caps. We're not going to emerge from the fact recently reported that Greenland, enormous quantity of ice, has reached a point where the melting of the ice cap is irreversible. It's going to go on. That's a legacy for future generations. We have to recognize that what we're doing now to the environment is not reversible, except by some miraculous new technology that nobody knows about. It's going to be there essentially permanently. And it's getting worse, and we don't have much time. The large parts of the world that are inhabited now will be literally uninhabitable within another couple of decades if this continues, probably including Morocco. There are ways to stop it. We know how to stop it, but it's kind of like the virus. It's not enough to have knowledge, you have to act. And in fact, countries are acting. Not enough, but some. The country that's doing most is the United States. It's trying to make the crisis worse. So, nicely timed with the announcement that Greenland ice is past the tipping point. President Trump opened up for drilling the only large wildlife reserve in the United States, in Alaska. Opened it up for drilling. I mean, even on pure economic grounds, this is lunacy. There's an oil glut. Even the oil companies don't want more drilling. They can't sell what they have. But he opened it up because that's a way to drive more quickly towards disaster and to satisfy the fossil fuel industries, other industries that fund his campaign. We've never seen anything like this. It's a level of malevolence and evil that the world has never seen, literally. And it's not changed, it's going to destroy us. Now, there are alternatives. Europe, for example, could become a force in world affairs. Has the largest economy in the world, the most educated population, many advantages, sits in the background, can't handle its own problems, can't act as a player in the world. Europeans say they don't like what's happening, but they're not doing much to reverse it. That can change. Same is true of North Africa. Plenty of awful problems. have to tell you about them. But these things are under human control. We can change it. Don't have a lot of time, but we can.
Yes, yes, Professor Chomsky, before we talk about the effects of COVID-19 after the effect of coronavirus, I would like you to ask you another question. In addition to the Trump administration and the Republicans, you know that some media try to blame China for this crisis. Does this play a geopolitical role, or is it just part of the media element to divert attention?
The media are following the lead of government policy. President Trump is flailing around desperately to find somebody to blame for the crimes he's committed against the American people. He's responsible for killing well over 100,000 people in the last few months, Americans. That doesn't want that to be on his record. So let's blame somebody else. We'll blame the World Health Organization. Let's destroy the World Health Organization and condemn unknown numbers of Africans, Yemenis, others to death because they won't get the services of the World Health Organization. Let's do that because maybe we can blame them for my crimes. Then comes China. Let's blame China. Actually, that's not hard in the West. The so-called yellow peril that goes way back a century. Terrible racist condemnation of Chinese. Chinese were kept out of the United States throughout the 19th century, early 20th century. Pure racism. It's brought up over and over. Now, China did make mistakes. They did things that were wrong in January. At the peak of the crisis, lots of confusion. Local officials did not provide the central authorities with full information that they needed. So the record is by no means perfect. Much better, incomparably better than the US reaction or even the European reaction, but defective. So let's blame China. Let's say China, it's a Trump typical racist remark, likes to call it the Chinese flu. If we follow that policy, the huge pandemic in 1918, which is much worse than this, at least so far, should be called the Kansas flu, because it originated in a military base in the state of Kansas in the United States. If we want to be anti-American racists, call it the Kansas flu. So Trump calls it the Chinese flu, and the media follow along. It's not, the charges are not worthless. There are correct charges, but nothing like what's being claimed, which is, as I say, an effort to shift blame from the crimes of the White House. Now, in fact, whatever the faults of the way the Chinese reacted, very quickly, a couple of weeks after the first symptoms were detected, they had provided the world with the sequenced genome, meaning virologists all over the world knew exactly what was going on and how to deal with it. Okay, can't blame anyone else for what happened, anyone for what happened after that. But it's a sordid business, the undermining of the World Health Organization in the midst of a pandemic is even more grotesque. As I say, consigns lots of people to death and suffering. It's not a small matter. And that's the world we live in. It has to be changed and quickly.
Yes, Professor, in the same vein, since we know that China reacted quickly, do you think it is possible that there is a conspiracy behind the COVID-19 pandemic?
No, it's not. Nothing is totally impossible, but the possibility is so remote that there's no need to think about it. And just to tell you, I'm sure you've heard this story going around that the pandemic was initiated by Bill Gates, George Soros, others, to try to put chips in people's heads to control the world. Now, that story has reached 70% of Americans. Of those, about 2/3 of Republicans believe it. I mean, this tells you something. It's pretty sick. And it's not just the United States. It could be another personal anecdote. One of the plagues of the internet, which we'll see more and more of over the years, is that it's possible to post an article on the internet under somebody else's name, make it look as if they wrote it. And there's just nothing you can do about that. It's happened to me several times. You can, point it out, you can correct it, but once it's up there, it's permanent. At the beginning of the pandemic, somebody, I don't know who, put up a story saying that the pandemic was originated in a U.S. Military laboratory as part of a U.S. government effort to control the world, under my name, circulated all over. And I started getting letters from people all over, including Europe, sometimes sensible people, even colleagues, saying, "Thank you for finally telling the truth about what's happening." I mean, people are willing to believe almost anything. It's a very dangerous situation. I mean, so dangerous that in the United States, I don't know the figures elsewhere, in the United States, probably about half the population say they will refuse to take a vaccine if the vaccine is developed, because the government may be trying to poison it, or Bill Gates may be trying to poison it. This is pretty serious. It means, for example, that the pandemic may be permanent. If half the population says, "I'm not going to do it," you'll never reach general immunity. I mean, every person who is infected is like a time bomb waiting to explode. They kill others, not just themselves. So if they refuse to take preventive treatment, it'll go on forever. Now, that's the effect of the attack on science and on rationality and on clear thinking. These are very serious developments. It's a deep problem of the reigning culture. And I think it traces back to the attacks on the population that have taken place in the last 40 years. The neoliberal programs, whatever it was the intention of the planners, we could debate that, but the design was very clear. The consequences are very clear. It's brutal class war. That's neoliberalism. It's designed to concentrate wealth and power in a tiny segment of the population, mostly financial institutions, which are generally harmful to the economy, they're predatory, and to take it away from institutions that are somewhat under public control. When Reagan says government is the problem, what the words mean, let's take decisions away from government, which is at least partially responsive to the public and under its influence, and let's put them in the hands of private institutions which are totally unaccountable to the public and which are driven solely by the goal of maximizing profit and market share. Let's let them make all the decisions. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going to happen. And we've seen what happened. So, for example, in the United States, 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1% of the population now hold 20% of the wealth. That's twice what they had when Reagan came into office. A majority of the population can barely get by from one paycheck to the next. If anything goes wrong, in trouble. Has many effects on the pandemic. So one of the effects of neoliberalism is that you have to run everything on a business model, including hospitals. When you run hospitals on a business model, it means no waste. Everything is what's called just on time. So just enough hospital beds for what you need now. Don't waste resources on extra ones. What happens when something is out of the ordinary? Catastrophe. If it happens on the assembly line of the Ford Motor Company, okay, you can hold up the assembly line for a little while you fix it up. You can't do that with an outburst of disease. This is lethal. There simply aren't enough even hospital beds. Other countries, like say Germany, which is a neoliberal country, but not this extreme, they did have extra beds, extra diagnostic capacities. They were able to put them to use. It's not an anti-science government, it's a pro-science government. Merkel, scientist herself, they immediately put into action, as soon as they figured out what was happening, the proper procedures, they had facilities they were able to deal with. Under strict neoliberal rules, it's a catastrophe. That's the United States, an extreme example. Britain is pretty close, but certainly doesn't have to happen. And the result of all of this is that people all over the world, there's anger, resentment, fear and contempt for major institutions. This is exacerbated in Europe by the radically undemocratic character of the European Union. Under European Union rules, important decisions are removed from the nation states, where again the population has some influence. They're transferred to unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. The European Commission, which is unelected, IMF, obviously unelected, central bank, of course, unelected. They make the major decisions. So people feel rightly that they're disenfranchised. No, we can't do anything. We try to do something. The bureaucracy, which is heavily influenced by the big banks, German banks, they'll say you can't do it. Actually, Europe is finally breaking out of this. One of the effects of the pandemic, good effect, is that Europe has finally decided to break out of these ridiculous constraints, economically absurd, even the IMF says that, with the high austerity, which just makes crises worse. They've been doing that throughout the whole neoliberal period since Maastricht, especially since the 1990s. It's very seriously harmed Europe, and it's created a population, as I said, that is angry, rightly. Same in the United States. Trump supporters are people who are bitter, resentful, they don't like what's happening to them. It's fertile terrain for demagogues who say, just listen to me, I can save you. We've seen this before. I'm old enough to remember it in my childhood. Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, not pretty. So that's where they flourish, this kind of system. And so the problems are not just Trump, not just Bolsonaro, not just Orban, but goes deeper. They're exploiting the crisis for their own benefit and power, but it's deeper. All of these things can be under control, but they're not going to cure themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, Professor Noam Chomsky, since you mentioned neoliberalism, so let's move on to talk about the effects of COVID-19. What will be the economic and the political impact of this health crisis in both the United States and the world? Do you think that the world relationships, I mean, the relationships between superpower countries will be reconsidered? In other words, will alliances endure or collapse?
Right. It could go in any direction. Let me go back to my childhood again. Okay. I was born right before the Great Depression. It hit the whole world. There were various ways to react to the Great Depression. Two different ways, mainly. One was the way that was taken in Germany, Nazism. The other is the way that was taken in the United States, much of Europe, social democracy. Okay. Came from the same crisis, reacted differently. There was no way to predict it. And take, say, Germany again. In the 1920s, Germany was the country was the peak of Western civilization. Educated population, outstanding work in the sciences, in the arts, music, was regarded as the model democracy. American political scientists regarded the Weimar Republic as the best democracy in the world. And that's Germany in the 1920s. Okay, Depression hit. There were several political organizations, not parties. One was the Nazis. They were small. In the 1928 elections, they had, I think, 3% of the vote. There were two huge left organizations, Communist Party, Socialist Party. Between the two of them, with the two of them together, they greatly outnumbered the Nazis. If they had gotten together for the 1932 elections, the last elections in Germany, they would have taken power. But they were too busy fighting each other. The Communist Party was under the orders of Joseph Stalin. The line of the Stalinists at that time was that everyone is a social fascist. So the Social Democrats are the same as the Nazis. You can't cooperate with them. Socialists, not that bad, but they also were not working towards cooperation. Result was, we know, the worst government in human history. After 10 years after being the most civilized country in the world, did not have to go that way. Take the United States. Depression hit in 1929. Took about 5 years before there was any serious reaction. I'm old enough to begin to remember. Finally, around 1933, 1934, you started to get organized popular protests. The labor movement had been virtually crushed in the 1920s, pretty much like today, but it revitalized. It had organized, the CIO began to organize. A lot of solidarity, black and white workers. They began to take militant actions. They moved as far as occupying factories, which is very serious because the next step after that is to say, we don't need the bosses, we can run it ourselves. At that point, you started getting actions. Now, the government happened to be fairly sympathetic, which is important, the Roosevelt administration. So lots of actions were taken, which didn't end the Depression, but they had a very positive effect on the country, right up until today. Today's Social Security, the medical care, it's not advanced in the United States. Social welfare system is very backward, but there's something. It came from the New Deal. The same is true of huge government projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which took some of the poorest regions in the country, rural Arkansas, created energy, industry, agricultural development. The Dust Bowl, which had been created by the United States, should have a very, very productive agriculture. There's enormous advantages. But agricultural practices had begun to destroy the main centers for American agricultural production. This was stopped by New Deal programs, who introduced scientific management, changed the practices of the big corporations, and small farmers managed to control it and put it back into operation. So there were many achievements. It put people back to work. Important things like government, people paid by the government were building, working on conservation, development, infrastructure, and so on. All of these things can be done. Well, didn't quite end the Depression because business was so strongly against it that they couldn't do it sufficiently. Well, the war came along. At that point, all the bars were down. Government could spend anything it wanted, control everything it wanted. Instant wage and price control production. Huge boost to the economy. The manufacturing quadrupled. The United States came out of the war richer and more powerful than it had ever been. Comparable policies today could deal easily with the crises that we now have. So dealing with the very serious global warming crisis, it's estimated would take a small fraction of the expenditures that were used during the Second World War. It's all feasible, just as Europe can get out of its crazed austerity mania by carrying out the policies they're now beginning to implement. Several $1 trillion reconstruction program. All of this is possible. With regard to the pandemic and the next one that's coming, we know what has to be done. It can be done right now. Serious research and development into coronaviruses, preparation of vaccines, working on trying to get a universal flu vaccine. Difficult scientific problem, but not out of bounds. Harder problems have been solved. If the resources are put into it, these things can be done. But it has to be done. It's not going to be done by itself. It's going to take a lot of organized public pressure to get governments to do it, to overcome the resistance of the major centers of private power, who are plainly going to resist it. They don't want their power taken away. So it's kind of class war on a global scale.
Yeah, yes, Professor, since we are talking about the alliances, the new alliances may appear after COVID-19. So what do you think about the power of, or what is called China, the new power, the superpower, as a superpower country? Do you think that China will rule the world after COVID-19?
There's a lot of speculation about that. It's been going on for decades, incidentally. You can read articles in the major U.S. journals of international affairs 20 years ago saying that China and India are going to be the dominant powers in the world. I don't believe that for a minute. If it ever happens, it'll be way off. President Trump has severely harmed the United States. There's no question about that. But even Trump's wrecking ball can't change the fact that the United States is the overwhelmingly dominant power in the world for many fundamental reasons. For one thing, the United States has advantages that no one else comes close to. Huge territory, pretty homogeneous. You can fly 3,000 miles and it looks like the place you came from. People speak the same language. They go to the same stores and so on. Huge agricultural resources, not duplicated anywhere. Mineral resources, enormous security beyond anything anyone can dream of. Controls the whole hemisphere, controls the oceans, controls the air, and dominates most of the rest of the world. The military expenditures are greater than the next practically dozen powers combined, much more sophisticated. Now, the US is the only country in the world that can issue sanctions against others. And when the United States issues sanctions, everyone has to follow them. Otherwise, they get thrown out of the international financial system. We're seeing that dramatically right at this moment. Right now, the United States is trying to get the United Nations to renew the sanctions against Iran. Everyone is opposed. They're afraid to vote against the United States. That's too dangerous. There's a maniac on the loose, you don't want to anger him. So they abstain. The United States went to the Security Council to try to get support from this, got one vote. Colombia, Dominican Republic, little island off the United States. They voted with the United States, nobody else. It's now coming with an effort to renew it again. It'll turn out the same. Nobody will support it, but they won't do anything about it. So Europe hates US sanctions against Iran. But are they going to do anything about it? They've made some gestures, but they can't anger the United States. It's too powerful and too violent. That's dominance. No other. Take, say, Israel-Palestine. It's very striking what happened there. The Trump administration came out with what they called the greatest deal of the century, written by Benjamin Netanyahu, handed to Jared Kushner, released by the White House. If any other country had come out with that proposal, you know what it is, people would have laughed. If they'd even paid attention, they would have laughed. When the US does it, everyone observes it. So the commentary immediately after was, well, this is the new situation, and how can we accommodate to it? That's the kind of power that you just don't see anywhere. There's nothing closely to approaching it anywhere. Now, China does have a growing economy. It's developing, and it's not just, at the beginning, it was just kind of assembling things for Western corporations. Now it's moving into high-tech areas. But it's nothing like the United States. If you take a look at the Human Development Index of the United Nations, China ranks around 90th. India maybe 130th. They have severe internal problems that the more developed countries don't have. Incidentally, is going not much time to go into history, but this is not because of, this is because of very specific developments. European imperialism. You go back a couple of centuries, China and India were the industrial, commercial centers of the world. What happened? European imperialism, which smashed them, stole their higher technology, deindustrialized them, undermined their societies and civilizations. Now they're trying to catch up, but it's going to be a long process. Enormous internal problems that the West doesn't have. Even more serious ones. Take India. If current energy programs persist, most of India will be uninhabitable in a couple of decades. The temperatures are already reaching 50 degrees centigrade in some places. It's basically unlivable. And it's going to continue. Take Bangladesh. The last figures I heard, about a third of Bangladesh was underwater with severe weather events and rising seas. Remember that the capital of Bangladesh was the richest place in the world when Robert Clive, British explorer, landed there. Couldn't believe the wealth and opulence of what's now Bangladesh, East Bengal. Well, what happened?
Yes.
Didn't happen.
Yes,
accident.
Yes.
Same
Yes,
as true.
Professor.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question, since we are facing this unprecedented phenomenon, so what lessons should we learn from this crisis, COVID-19? What positive lessons can we learn from the pandemic?
Well, we can take a look at some of the things that have happened and learn lessons from them. One thing that's happened is around large parts of the world, there has been an upsurge of local programs of mutual aid and support. People are helping each other instead of just trying to gain everything I can for myself and forgetting everybody else. Let's work on this together. If in some neighborhood there is an elderly person in an apartment who doesn't have food, let's get food to them. If people can't act properly by social distancing, let's arrange it for them. This is happening in the most amazing ways. So it takes, say, Brazil, awful president, a clone of President Trump, terrible reaction, awful catastrophe. You go to Rio de Janeiro, the favelas, the slums, horrible slums. Government is doing nothing for the people, but they're being organized to deal with the pandemic somehow. Who's doing it? The criminal gangs that have been terrorizing the region. They've gotten together to try to help bring water to people who don't have water, to get people to try to separate as much as is possible under those horrible conditions. And you're seeing this everywhere. That's one lesson. We can work together to help each other. Now we can do it on an international scale. So take Italy again. Mentioned before that the peak of the crisis in Europe, the first place was northern Italy. There happen to be two rich countries right north of Italy, Austria and Germany. They were able to get the crisis pretty much under control for themselves. Did they help northern Italy? No. They were taking care of themselves. This is supposed to be a European Union. But Italy could turn for help to Cuba. Cuba sent the doctors and medical aid to help northern Italy at the peak of the pandemic. That's traditional. They've been doing it for years. Cuba is a very poor country, subjected to 60 years of US terror, vicious economic strangulation. But somehow Cuba was able to be the one genuine internationalist country in the world. That's not only a lesson, but it should shame the rich countries, especially the United States, which is still torturing Cuba and increasing the torture under Trump. So yes, there are lessons, mutual aid at the local level, internationalism at the general level. All that can extend. If we don't have genuine internationalism, we'll never get out of this. Every one of the crises today is an international crisis. The pandemic is obviously international. So New Zealand can terminate the virus as it did for several months, no more cases. Vietnam had no cases at all, but they can't stay that way. They can't wall themselves off from the world. There's going to be travel, interaction, it'll come back. It's an international crisis. The vaccine, when it's available, should be a public good, should be for everyone, In fact, all vaccines should be. The idea that there's any profit to be made out of vaccines is obscene. Other governments, meanwhile, are trying to monopolize it for themselves. Okay, you could have genuine internationalism when it's not a utopian idea. The polio, when I was a young person, was a frightening disease. I remember very well. The Salk vaccine, which was produced with government support and initiative, was made freely available to the world. No patent, no profit. It's a public good, like the air you breathe. That's the way it should be. In fact, that's the way medicine should be. That can be done. And the same is true of global warming. I mean, you don't have to talk about it. It's a global problem. If the United States, under a malevolent administration, decides to race the disaster, the whole world is in deep trouble. It's got to be done globally. And in fact, this is true of just about everything you think about. Take, say, the exportation of jobs, which is harmful. Say, when American workers have a plant closed because they want to send the jobs to Mexico or China. It's a problem for the American workers. How do you deal with it? First of all, by taking the decisions away from bankers in New York and putting them in the hands of the workforce in the community. First step. Second step, internationalism. American workers have shared interests with Chinese and Mexican workers. China has a huge number of labor actions protesting against inhuman conditions. They can be supported by American workers. The unions to this day are still called internationalists, remembering an earlier ideal that they would be international. That can be reconstructed. Then these problems can be worked out by the people who bear the costs, the working class and communities, not by a gang of rich bankers who are trying to maximize profit for themselves. Okay, then you get a very different world, and you can deal with the crises. But I think it's fair to say that we're facing a choice between internationalism and literally extinction. Not that everybody in the world will die, but life will be unrecognizable. You just have to remember the situation we're in. You take a look at CO2 particles in the atmosphere. It's almost doubled since the Industrial Revolution. It's now at a level that was last reached close to a level which is now reached about 3 million years ago. It's getting close to that. At that point, the sea levels were about 30 meters higher, 25 meters higher. Can you imagine what human life is like that? I haven't seen specific studies for Morocco, but I have seen studies by Israeli geophysicists and climate specialists on the Levant, what's going to happen in the Levant region, Eastern Mediterranean. Their prediction is that within a couple of decades, the Mediterranean will have heated up so much that over the summer, it'll be about at the level of a jacuzzi, something you go into for a hot bath. And meanwhile, the sea level will have expanded over most of Israel and Lebanon. The region will be destroyed. The Gulf region is just going to disappear. Nobody will be able to live there. I mean, today you can do it with high technology, but it's going to get to the point where that's impossible. Where I live, Arizona, it happens to be, we're in a position where a drought, there's a river, the Colorado River, which provides water for the west and southwest. It's fed by glaciers. They're melting. This means the Colorado River is declining. That means the temperatures here are already about 40 degrees centigrade, something like that. They're going to go up. water will be gone. It'll be desert. That's the Southwest United States. This is what we're heading towards. Nobody's going to escape. I mean, there are some rich people who think they can build a gated community up in the Alps somewhere. No, that's not going to work. It's essentially over if we don't address this crisis so seriously. I mean, leading climate scientists are saying, panic now, don't wait. Those are their words. We have to act decisively now. Again, we know how to do it. There are careful studies that show that, talking about the United States, that the problems here could be settled with a fraction of the expenses used to fight the Second World War. Again, it's not a utopian dream. And furthermore, it would make a better world. It's a much better world if you don't have to sit in a traffic jam for 3 hours to get to work, but you have efficient mass transportation. It's a better world if you're not dying of pollution from fossil fuels. There's a lot of improvements in the world possible, and they're feasible, but not unless something is done. To predict, if we go on our current course, we can predict with very high confidence that organized human society will not survive.
Yes, Professor, thank you very much for the explanation. Professor Chomsky, you mentioned, I think, a long time ago, maybe on Twitter, there is a post on Twitter that about the vaccine, that they will develop the vaccine for COVID or something like that, and they should give it to people for free as to forgive their sins. So what do you think? So why do you say that? Did you think that the vaccine was created and that they should develop that the virus was created and that they should develop the vaccine for that to forgive their sins?
Well, I should say that the Twitter account is not mine. It's under my name, but I know nothing about it. It's one of these things that happens in the internet age. So the first part I agree with. Yes, it should be free. We have plenty of sins, but we should overcome them. We're not asking anyone to forgive them. We should pay attention to them, overcome them. And in fact, one of the sins is that my computer is dying in another two or 3 minutes. So I'm afraid I'll have to. Has to be recorded.
We are running more than 1 hour. Thank you very much for being patient with us.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
So maybe I will ask you another question before. So since we are talking about vaccine, you know that Russia now developed vaccine for COVID-19. So what is your comment on that?
We don't know. In fact, Putin, when he announced it, was very cautious, if you listen carefully. He said there's a vaccine under preparation, hasn't been adequately tested. So we basically don't know. There are lots of vaccines being developed. Some of them are moving to a testing phase. It takes time, can't rush it. You're not going to know the results of a test maybe for years, serious results. So we shouldn't expect a miracle cure. And in fact, it's just possible. So far, the virus has not mutated very much. It has a little, but not much. Could start mutating. Then you have a situation like flu, where you have a lot of different strains. Maybe you have a vaccine for some, but not for others. So there's not going to be any miracle. There will sooner or later be vaccines, maybe several, and they should be free. They should be for everyone, like the Salk vaccine for polio, and everyone should agree to take them. I mentioned that in the United States, about half the population is so alienated and frightened and angry about government that they're refusing to take it. They say they'll refuse to take it, which is a disaster. means the pandemic never goes away. Each one who doesn't take it infects others, and it escalates exponentially. So there's plenty.
Yes, maybe another question, because you said that's your laptop. You know that the effect of coronavirus shaped or the world into new directions, and we know that terrorist attacks stopped during COVID-19. Who's behind such terrorist acts?
Terrorist acts?
Yes. So we know that we don't see no more, let's say, a terrorist attack acts during COVID-19.
We don't know the details, but we do know the details for the last couple of years. So the FBI comes out with a review of terrorist acts in the United States. Now, there aren't many, but there's a fair number. If you go back to 2016, about 20% of the terrorist acts were attributed to white supremacists. You go back to last year, it was close to 100%. Through the Trump years, white supremacist terrorist acts have pretty much taken over. Now, that doesn't say that every act, say, burning a police station is a white supremacist act, but that's the curve, that's the tendency. Trump has strongly encouraged and incited white supremacist actions, commitments, including the terrorist fringe.
Okay, so
I really do have to get because the computer's dying.
Yeah, okay, so maybe we can say that it's time. Maybe we come to the end of this presentation for this interview, interesting webinar with Professor Noam Chomsky. We thank you very much, Professor, for being with us today. We are running more than 1 hour. Thank you so much for your patience, for being here. It was a great honor for us, and we wish you a long life full of happiness, and appreciate your explanation and answer to all of our questions. Thank you very much.
Very good to be with you.
Thank you.